Let me give you one example. The steel workers in the 40s and the 50s, up until about 1960, was one of the largest unions in the world. It had close to 2 million workers. Its president, who happened to be a very good friend of mine, I think he's dead now, I don't think it would be objective by describing him as a civilized playboy. He loved the bright lights. He loved to be seen in the Broadway shows, in the good restaurants in New York, the whole bit. The present president of the steelworkers is the son of a Protestant minister from Canada, from Ontario, who is, I won't say straight-laced or puritanical, but he's a very, very orderly, non-playboy type of man. The only problem is he has only half the number of members that McDonald had. And he has no control over that. Nothing he can do to bring back the steel that's being made now in Korea and other parts of the world, which were not true in McDonald's time. There are structural changes which were beyond McDonald's control. They were in his favor then, and there are structural changes which are largely beyond the control of the present president of the union, who's a very fine, statesman-like, hardworking, non-playboy type of trade union leader. So it's very difficult to know exactly what the reasons are, a whole variety of them. There's some hope. We were talking about it at supper tonight. The new look in the Teamster Union obviously means it's going to be a cleaner union. There's going to be a great shake-up at the level of racketeering and so forth in that particular union. But more importantly, there's going to be, I think, a shake-up in the strength of the union. The new leadership, I think, intends to become very serious about organizing workers and fighting harder for new contracts, etc. A very, very promising man to watch, the new president of the Teamsters, Ron Carey. Yes?
There is also a deliberate attempt, isn't there, by the big corporate interests to kill unions with propaganda and even buyouts and things of that nature?
On the part of some. I wouldn't generalize it. For example, I can't conceive of anybody still in his right mind in the auto industry who would like to do away with UAW. You couldn't operate the auto industry without an effective union. However, there are some who are obviously using buyouts and other means to weaken unions. And in the case of some smaller industries, there's very clear evidence that they're using management consulting firms to go in and break them. But I wouldn't generalize. I don't really believe that the auto industry, for example, or the steel industry wants to put those unions out of business. They will fight hard for the kind of contracts they want, but that's different from wanting to put them out of business.
Well, Walmart, for example, boasts to have no unions.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
But while they hire most of their employees are part-time.
Sure.
And it's by design, it appears to me.
Well, the reason they hire them part-time is because they don't have to pay any benefits.
That's right.
They don't have any health insurance benefits. That's why the figures on unemployment are so deceptive today.
Right.
The official figures, I think, are now 7.1%. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There may be 3 or 4 million people who are part-time, deliberately part-time.
Right.
They're hired as part-time workers so that they won't have to pay benefits.
Exactly.
There are another million or two who have stopped looking for jobs. So the real figure could be as high as 10 or 12%. But the practice of hiring part-time workers as a deliberate policy is clearly an attempt to break unions.
Right.
And to avoid paying benefits. And that's why the health insurance crisis is so serious. There are so many, there are 30, 40, nobody knows how many, at least 35 or 40 million people without any health insurance. And many of them working in these part-time jobs. Yes?
Would you care to comment on the role of the papacy in appointing very conservative or ultra-conservative bishops and archbishops in the United States in the last 10 years? And in relationship, they are no longer activists such as Bishop Dingman was an activist in his field, but for the most part, the ones I've...
Well, I would make a distinction. I'd be very happy to comment, preferably over a scotch and soda, about conservative bishops on church matters. But I make a sharp distinction between that and the appointment of bishops who are socially minded. I'll give you an example. Most people whom I know, in the circles in which I move, consider John O'Connor, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, a conservative. By that they mean a conservative theologically and culturally. He is the most pro-labor bishop in the history of in my time in the church. And the labor movement will tell you that. There's never been a bishop more pro-labor that I know of than John O'Connor. Forthrightly so, publicly so, and not only for others, also for his own institutions. He will allow no interference with the right of workers to organize in his own schools and hospitals, etc. There's a classic tradition in the church, classic history, of bishops being conservative on church matters and at the same time being fairly progressive on economic matters. Archbishop Lucy of San Antonio comes to my mind immediately. He was the most progressive bishop of his time, certainly in the South, in the Southwest, but he was a horribly conservative man on a number of church matters. And it's not an uncommon, the present Pope, I think, would be considered conservative on theological matters. But I can assure you the workers in Poland do not consider him a conservative on economic matters. I was in Poland a number of times at the time Solidarity was started and since then. And there would have been no Solidarity movement in Poland had it not been for the Pope giving him the umbrella of his blessing. So the two get mixed up. But O'Connor to me is the classic case today. You talk to the average priest, at least the average priest I run into, they say, well, O'Connor's a very conservative. He's another example of the Pope appointing conservative bishops. That may well be true in the field they're talking about, but it is not true in the social field. Not at all true. Yes?
I was wondering, in the United States is basically going to a service economy, and 60 or 70% of that is created by, or the service economy is by employers of under 100 people. Is it more important to stress the employee ownership of the company rather than labor unions?
I don't know how you're going to get effective ownership of companies, honest ownership of companies without union, without somebody to represent the workers. If you can get it without it, fine. There's nothing, sacrosanct about a union saying that in every instance you must have a union. But the right to organize is the important thing that must be recognized, and it seems to me unlikely in the kind of world in which we live that you will have effective co-management or co-ownership without a union there to represent the workers fighting for it and to monitor it. That's why someone raised the question at dinner tonight about quality circles and other forms of labor management cooperation, a very controversial subject in some unions today. My own opinion is that when they're good, they're good. When they're bad, they're bad. But they will always be bad if there's not a strong union there to represent the workers in this form of labor management cooperation. They become then, in effect, an instrument by the company to control the workers under another heading. Yes?
Well, how would you compare the American system to the Japanese system? There aren't aren't that many unions in Japan, are there?
Oh yes, there are more workers organized in Japan than in the United States, percentage-wise. I think their percentage is something like 30%. Ours is about 18%. I've been to Japan. I've met with all of the major Japanese labor leaders, but I must say I don't know enough about it to know how effective their unions are. They are described in many of the books that I've read about Japan as being under the control of the companies, being less aggressive than they might be. Whether that's fully true or not, I don't know, but percentage-wise, they're better organized than we are, numerically.
Well, there seems to be much greater cooperation between management and labor, though, in Japan than there is in the United States. Whereas in the United States, it seems much more an adversarial relationship. Yeah. And from what I understand today from people that I know in business and things, that there needs to be a greater cooperation between the two. Is there a movement toward that in the United States?
Well, that's the point I touched upon briefly in my prepared remarks, that I'm all in favor of that, but I don't think you can talk about it realistically unless you have a strong labor movement. How do you get really effective labor management cooperation if one side is ruled out to begin with? If they say you have no right to exist, it's not going to be very effective labor management. And the Bishop's Pastoral on the Economy makes that point very emphatically, saying, yes, we should have new forms of labor management cooperation, a new partnership, but it's a two-way street. Not all of the sacrifices will be made by one side, and people must be free to be represented. That's the argument over quality circles again. I'm very conscious of it because I happen to be closely related to the Auto Workers Union. I'm the chairman of one of their committees, and I hear it every month that there's a big argument going on within the Auto Workers Union Some say that quality circles and new forms of labor management cooperation are the only hope for the industry. Others say, not unless you're going to be much more aggressive and make sure that these don't become just window dressing. So that's the debate they're going to have to carry out within their own circles to see how it comes out. But the Japanese, I think it would be very unrealistic to draw too close a comparison on anything between the Japanese system and ours because the culture is so different. They're a totally homogeneous society, as you know. Very nationalistic, totally homogeneous. The way blacks are treated have been treated in the past in the United States and are still treated in many places is the way Koreans are treated in Japan. Totally homogeneous, very nationalistic, and with a sort of Confucian form of cooperation which is totally foreign to our culture. I'll give you one example. The last time I was in Japan, I was staying with the Marino brothers in Tokyo, and their property adjoins the Sophia University, the International Jesuit University. And right next door to them, the Sophia was building a new library. And one of the Marinotas, who spoke Japanese fluently, said, "Come on, I want to show you something." We looked out the window, sat up on the porch, and watched these construction workers as they were getting ready to go to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. They lined up like school kids in the schoolyard. When the sister would ring the bell, at least when I was in school, you lined up. Waited for further instructions. As soon as they got lined up, someone got up and gave them a speech. Then gave them a report on what they had done the day before and their goals for the present day. Then they all cheered, and another man got up and gave them a pep talk. And then they did calisthenics for 10 minutes. You can imagine trying to get American construction workers to do any one of those. It's a totally different culture. And their whole legal system. We have, in Washington alone, we have more lawyers than in all of Japan. And not all of those lawyers are up to good. Many of them, of course, are in some kind of adversarial relationship with somebody. Whereas the Japanese system their culture is completely different. So it's very hard, I think, to make comparisons. The other myth that I think that may be on the way out now is that the Japanese work harder than we do. There's all kinds of evidence that Americans are working harder today than they've ever worked because, among other things, you've got two people working in the family, which means that you've got all kinds of added problems with family work, new forms of travel, time, and so forth. The number of hours being worked today, I think, is much higher. And there's nobody arguing for shorter hours in the United States. The trade union movement did, for a long time, fight for shorter hours, but they haven't been strong enough to do anything about that in recent times. And so I think it's simply not true to say that the Japanese are more successful because they work longer than we do or harder. Our people, I think, are being overworked. A very good new book on it just came out in the last few weeks by a professor from Harvard, a woman professor, excellent book, called The Overworked American. Very favorably reviewed in yesterday's New York Times in a front page review, and an excellent book. So there are a lot of intangibles. When people say, why don't we do what the Japanese do? Well, we'd have to become Japanese to do it. And yes, time to go home. Thank you very much.